alarm went off at 6, same as always. I lay there for a minute before I got up, listening to the birds outside the window. My neighbor's dog was barking again down the street. Normal Tuesday morning in Claremont, North Carolina, except nothing was normal anymore. My daughter-in-law had moved out 3 days ago, and my son hadn't spoken to me since. I'm going to tell you what happened. All of it. Because I'm 64 years old, and I've spent enough of my life staying quiet when I shouldn't have. My name is Walter, not the one who stays in his lane, not the one who nods and smiles and pretends everything's fine. I learned that lesson the hard way. My wife Claire passed 11 years ago, just before our son turned 22. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand when she went, and I drove home alone to a house that smelled like her shampoo for months afterward. You don't get over that. You just learn to carry it differently. My son. I'll call him my son throughout this because that's what matters. His name is Seth. He's 33 now. Smart kid. Stubborn like me. After college, he took a job in Charlotte, came home for holidays, called on Sundays. We had that kind of relationship. Not perfect, but solid. Built on 22 years of the same kitchen table, the same football games, the same arguments about whether it was better to change your oil every 3,000 miles, or 5. Good solid ground. He met Trina about 4 years ago, brought her Thanksgiving that first year, and she was fine, polite, a little quiet. She laughed at the right moments and helped clear the plates without being asked, which Claire always said was the truest indicator of a person's character. I thought, okay, good sign. By the second year, though, something had shifted. Small things at first. She'd correct Seth in the middle of a sentence. Not meanly, just firmly, like a teacher. He'd start to say something and she'd put her hand on his arm and say, "Actually, babe, I think what you mean is," and then finish his thought for him. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. Third year they got engaged. I was happy for him. I mean that. Seth looked at her the way I used to look at Claire, with that slightly dazed expression like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Who was I to say anything about small corrections and arm-touching? I'd been alone for 10 years. What did I know about how couples worked now? They moved into my house 8 months before the wedding. I want to be honest about why I agreed to that, because some people heard this story later and said I was naive. Maybe I was. Seth had been laid off. Tech job, restructuring, happens to everyone. And Trina's lease was up. My house has 4 bedrooms. Claire and I had always talked about grandchildren filling those rooms someday. And my knees weren't what they used to be, and the gutters needed work. And maybe, I'll admit this, maybe I was lonely in a way I didn't fully understand until they were there and the house was loud again. So they moved in. Seth and I repainted the kitchen. He fixed the gutters in one afternoon, both of us up on ladders trading insults about our respective ladder climbing techniques. It was good. For about 6 weeks it was genuinely good. Then the changes started. Trina began reorganizing things. First the kitchen cabinets. She said she was making it more efficient. I didn't love it, but it was just plates. Then the living room furniture, which she rearranged while I was at my Thursday bowling league. I came home and everything was pushed to the walls to create what she called a better flow. The armchair I'd had since Claire picked it out at an estate sale in 2003 was in the corner facing the window instead of the television. I mentioned it to Seth. He said Trina had a good eye for space. He said it casually, not dismissively. He genuinely believed it. I let it go. She started answering for me. When Seth's friends came over, when my brother came for a weekend in April, when neighbors stopped by, someone would ask me a question, and before I'd finished inhaling to answer, Trina was already talking. She'd smile at me afterward like we were in on something together. I started recording things. Not because I suspected something criminal. Not then. I'd been an accountant for 31 years. I know what it means to document. I have a small security camera in the living room that I'd installed after a rash of package thefts in the neighborhood 2 years ago. Trina didn't know about it. Not because I'd hidden it, but because I'd never mentioned it, and it's small. Just a gray oval above the bookshelf, the kind you stop seeing after a while. I also had a camera doorbell, which she did know about, and a camera over the garage, which she also knew about. The one inside she didn't. 6 weeks before the wedding, the financial conversation happened. I knew something was off because Seth came to me in the garage, not the kitchen. He always comes to the kitchen when it's normal. Garage means he thinks the conversation might be uncomfortable. He sat on the old workbench and he said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about the house." I put down my wrench. "Okay." He said Trina had done some research. Property values in Claremont had gone up considerably in the last few years, which was true. I'd watched them. He said she'd talked to a real estate attorney, just informally, just to understand the situation. And the situation, according to Trina's informal research, was that it might make more sense from a financial and tax perspective if the house were transferred into a family trust. I said, "That's a big word for what happens to the house when I die." Seth looked uncomfortable. "It's not just about that, Dad. It's about protecting the asset while you're alive, too." I asked who would be the trustee. He hesitated. I said, "Seth." He said Trina had suggested a shared trustee arrangement, him and her jointly. I kept my voice very steady. I said that Claire and I had paid off this house in 2019 after 26 years of a mortgage, and that it was mine, and that I wasn't going to sign it into any trust arrangement where my son's fiancée, a woman I had known for 3 years, held any legal authority over it. Seth said I was being defensive. I said I was being accurate. He left the garage and didn't come back that night. Trina was very pleasant at dinner. She asked about my bowling league. She passed the bread. I watched her, the way you watch weather on the horizon, when you've lived in North Carolina long enough to know what certain clouds mean. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Phil Greer. We went to UNC together. He's been handling my affairs since 1998. I told him about the conversation. He told me not to sign anything. He also suggested I make sure any existing documentation was current and clearly established. I updated my will. I made sure the house deed was exactly as it should be. I pulled out my insurance documents and read them front to back. Then I organized everything in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet, and I changed the combination from Claire's birthday, which Seth knew, to something else. 3 weeks before the wedding, Trina told my son I had hit her. I was in the backyard when it happened. It was a Saturday afternoon, just after 2. I know the time because I was listening to the pre-game show before the Panthers game started at 4:30. I had been in the backyard trimming the azalea bushes. I came inside through the back door, walked through the kitchen, and Trina was standing at the kitchen counter. She said something sharp to me about the way I'd handled a phone call with Seth's aunt. I'd apparently committed the crime of telling his aunt that the rehearsal dinner was at 7 when Trina said she'd specifically told everyone 7:30. I said I wasn't aware of the change. She said that wasn't good enough. I said, "Trina, this is still my house, and I'd appreciate a different tone." She went upstairs. 20 minutes later, Seth came downstairs with an expression I'd never seen on my son's face. A kind of closed-down, locked-in look. He said, "Dad, did you put your hands on her?" I said, "Excuse me?" He said Trina had come upstairs crying. She said I'd grabbed her arm when she walked past me in the kitchen. I stood there. I've been on this earth for 64 years, and I have never struck a woman or grabbed one in anger. My father didn't do it. I didn't do it. I said, "Seth, that did not happen." He said she was very upset. He said he didn't want to think I was capable of that, but he also had to take her side. I said, "You don't take sides when one side is a lie." He said he thought it might be better if I gave everyone some space. He wasn't asking me to leave my own house. He was just asking me to give them space, maybe stay at a hotel for a few days, let things cool down before the wedding. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I looked at my son who I raised, who I taught to ride a bike in this driveway, who I sat up with when he had mono at 19, and who cried at his mother's funeral with his head on my shoulder. And I said, "I'm going to stay in my own home, but I'm also going to show you something." I went to the living room. I opened the laptop on the desk by the bookshelf. I pulled up the app connected to the indoor camera, rewound it to 2:17 that afternoon, and pressed play. You could see the whole kitchen from that angle. You could see Trina standing at the counter. You could see me come through the back door. You could see our conversation, which lasted about 90 seconds. You could see me, clearly, with no ambiguity, standing 4 feet away from her for the entire duration. You could see her turn and walk out. You could see me turn and look out the window. At no point did I touch her. There was nothing to interpret. It was just what happened. Seth watched it twice. His face during those two viewings is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I'm not going to dramatize it. He watched the screen, and he got very still, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he went upstairs. I don't know everything that was said up there. I went to the kitchen, and I made myself a cup of coffee, and I sat at the table in the house that Claire and I bought together in 1993, and I drank it slowly, and I listened to the ceiling. After about 45 minutes, Seth came downstairs alone. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He said, "She's saying the camera might not have captured everything." I said, "It captured all of it." He said she was saying the angle could be misleading. I said, "Seth, you watched it. You know what you saw." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke my heart a little. He said, "I don't know what to do, Dad." And I said, "Yes, you do." I didn't say it with anger. I said it the way Claire used to say things when one of us was pretending to be confused about something we actually understood perfectly well. Just steady. Just, "Yes, you do." He didn't say anything else that night. He went back upstairs. The wedding was 12 days away. I stayed in my house. I went to my bowling league on Thursday. I had lunch with my brother on Friday, and I told him the broad strokes. He said I should call a lawyer. I told him I already had. He said I should move out anyway, just to avoid conflict. I said I wasn't going to do that. He looked at me the way people look at someone who's decided to stand in a doorway during a tornado, but he knows me well enough not to argue. The following week was quiet in the way that things are quiet when pressure is building. Trina was polite to me in a distant way that was worse than hostility. The kind of politeness that makes you invisible. Seth was trying to be normal, but he'd forgotten how. We watched a game together on Sunday, and we talked about football for 2 hours without once saying anything real. 4 days before the wedding, Seth came to me again. He said Trina had found something. She'd been looking through some of the house paperwork. She said she was trying to find the original deed to understand the trust situation better, though nobody had asked her to do that, and she'd found a discrepancy in the property tax records. I waited. He said there was a period in 2017 where it looked like a property tax payment had been delayed, and she was concerned that there might be a lien issue that could complicate the transfer of the house eventually, and she wanted to bring in her own attorney to look at the paperwork. I said, "Your own attorney?" He said yes. I said there is no lien. Phil handled my taxes that year because I had a billing issue with the county assessor's office. It was resolved in 4 months, and there is paperwork documenting the resolution in the lockbox in my closet. I would be happy to show Phil to her attorney any time she'd like. He said Trina felt like I was being obstructionist. I looked at my son. I said, "Son, you understand what's happening here, don't you?" He didn't answer. I said, "She is trying to establish grounds to challenge the ownership of this house. The physical assault accusation didn't accomplish that. Now she's trying the financial angle." He said I was being paranoid. I said, "I hope you're right." 2 days before the wedding, Phil called me. He'd done some digging based on what I'd told him. He'd found something I hadn't known to look for. Trina had, about 18 months earlier, incorporated a small LLC in Delaware under her own name. The LLC had received several wire transfers totaling about $62,000 over 14 months from a joint account she and Seth had opened together. Seth had apparently signed documents for that account without fully understanding what the LLC was for. Dill explained the structure to me quietly and clearly, and at the end he said, "Walter, your son needs to know about this before Saturday." I called Seth. He didn't answer. I texted him, "I need to talk to you tonight. It's important. Come to the kitchen." He came down at 9. I put Phil on speaker. Bill explained what he'd found. He spoke in the plain, unhurried way he has, the way that 40 years of law practice gives you, with no extra drama and no softening either. He said what the LLC was structured to do. He said what the transfer pattern suggested. He said Seth could verify all of this himself through Delaware's public business registry and through the records of the joint account. Seth sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Phil hung up. At some point, he put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "I'm sorry. I really am." He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "2 days." He said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I wanted to be sure before I put that in front of you. And because Phil needed to verify." He said, "All this time, she's been in this house for 8 months, and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We sat there for a while. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's porch light came on through the kitchen window. I thought about Claire, the way I often do when something big happens, and I thought about what she would say, and what she would say is what she always said, which is that the truth has a way of landing exactly when it needs to. The wedding didn't happen. Seth called his aunt that night, the one with the 7:30 confusion, and she helped him start making the calls. Some people were already flying in. The venue had to be notified. The caterer, his best friend, who had already driven from Pittsburgh. Trina left that night. Not quietly. She was not quiet, but she left. The morning after would have been the wedding day. I got up at 6, same as always. I made coffee. Seth came downstairs around 8 looking like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't. I made him eggs. The same scrambled eggs I made him every Saturday when he was growing up, with a little too much butter and some cheddar mixed in, the way he likes them, the way Claire invented them. I put the plate in front of him, and I sat across from him, and we ate together without saying much. After a while, he looked up at me and he said, "I should have believed you." I said, "You got there." He said, "That's not enough, Dad." I said, "It's enough for me. I mean that. I thought about it in the weeks since, and I mean it. I'm not pretending it didn't hurt. Those 12 days between the accusation and the wedding, being looked at by my own son with something that wasn't quite doubt but was close enough, that stays with you. But I also know who Seth is. I know what she was doing to him, slowly and carefully over 3 years. I know what it looks like when someone has been reshaped by the person they love, how the reshaping happens so gradually you don't see it from the inside. He's my son. I watched him grow up. I'm not throwing away 33 years because of 12 days. We went to see Phil together the following week. Phil walked Seth through everything. The LLC structure, the transfers, the pattern of it. Seth asked every question you'd want your child to ask. He didn't flinch from any of it. When it was over, he shook Phil's hand and he thanked him. And in the parking lot, he stood by the car for a moment, looking at the sky with his hands in his pockets. And then he said, "I feel like an idiot." I said, "You feel like someone who trusted the wrong person. That's different." He said, "I almost let her take your house, Dad." I said, "Almost." I said it the same way Claire used to say things. Just steady. Just steady. Just almost. We drove home. I made dinner. He stayed for the game. It's been 6 weeks now. Seth is living with me while he sorts out the financial piece, which Phil says will take some time but is manageable. Most of the transferred money can be clawed back through the LLC's records, and there's no question of fraud given the paper trail. Trina's attorney has already been in contact. It will probably settle before it goes anywhere formal. The house is quieter than it was 8 months ago, and louder than it was before they moved in. That's about right. I finished the azalea trimming last week. I rearranged the living room back the way Claire had it. The armchair facing the television where it belongs, the lamp by the window where the light hits it in the afternoon and makes that specific gold patch on the hardwood floor that I've been looking at for 20 years. Some things you don't move. Some things you put back. Seth called his aunt last Sunday to apologize about the 7:30 situation, which I thought was unnecessary, but also exactly right. I didn't tell this story for sympathy. I told it because I'm 64 and I've watched enough people my age go quiet when they should speak, accept things they shouldn't accept, make themselves small to keep the peace. I spent 11 years in this house keeping a version of peace that turned out not to be peace at all, but just a very convincing silence. Document things. Know what you own. Don't change your oil before you need to, but also don't wait until the engine seizes. That's about the whole of what I've learned, and if someone tells you a camera can't capture everything, it can. It captured all of it. People ask me sometimes if I regret letting them move in. I've thought about that question more than I should have. The honest answer is no, and not because it worked out, because if I'd said no back then, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering whether I'd been too guarded, too closed off, too much the kind of man who locks the door before the storm even arrives. You can't live that way. At least I can't. What I regret is the months I spent noticing things and saying nothing. That's on me. Not the camera, not Phil, not the timing. The silence before any of that was my own choice. And I made it for the wrong reasons. I made it because I wanted to keep the peace. And peace that requires you to shrink yourself isn't peace. It's just postponed damage. There's something I've come to understand about people who deceive the way Trina deceived. It doesn't start with a big lie. It starts with small adjustments. The furniture moved here. The answer given before you can speak. The document you didn't quite understand, but signed because you trusted the person handing you the pen. Each one is small enough to ignore. Together, they add up to something that can take everything from you. Trina wasn't calculating from the first day, but somewhere along the way she made a decision about what this situation was worth to her, and she started working toward it. That's a choice. Choices have weight, and eventually that weight lands. Seth already knew something was wrong before I showed him the camera footage. I believe that. He'd known for a while and had been working very hard not to know it. That's not weakness, exactly. That's what happens when you love someone, and the truth about them costs too much to look at directly. But the truth doesn't get smaller the longer you avoid it. It just gets more expensive. Seth found that out at a cost I wish he hadn't had to pay. And I think he'll carry some of that cost for a long time. That's part of it. That's how it works. What I keep coming back to is the documentation. Not as a strategy. I wasn't running some long game, but as a habit of mine. I documented because I'd spent 31 years as an accountant, and documentation is just how I think. Write it down. Keep the record. Don't assume you'll remember. That habit, built over a career that had nothing to do with any of this, turned out to be the one thing that mattered most when everything came apart. You never know which version of yourself you've been quietly building will be the one you need. Seth scrambled eggs this morning. First time he's cooked anything in this kitchen since he was 14 and nearly burned the stove down trying to make grilled cheese. They weren't bad. He used too little butter, which is wrong, but I didn't say anything. Some corrections can wait. I'm 64 years old, and I live in a house I've owned for 30 years, and my son is in the next room, and the armchair is where it belongs, and the light hits the floor at 4 in the afternoon, exactly the way it always has. That's enough. That's more than enough.